Welcome to the Battles We Pick podcast, where advocates and organizers talk about their work pushing for social, political, and policy change. This episode features a wide-ranging discussion of the types of advocacy roles foundations can play, particularly community foundations, the distinction between advocacy and lobbying, the complementary roles of public officials and non-governmental advocates, and how politics and public opinion plays into all of this. It's a wide-ranging conversation because my guests' experiences have ranged so widely. As director of the Center for Community Foundation Policy Leadership, Stephen Saloom helps community foundations play their full part shaping policy so they can strengthen the communities they serve while also strengthening their organizations. Trained as an attorney, Stephen has been a leading advocate on criminal justice reform for decades, including work for the Pew Charitable Trusts, the Proteus Fund, and as policy director for the Innocence Project. Be sure to listen to the whole episode, because Stephen and I concluded our conversation discussing what has and hasn't been achieved in reforming America's unjust justice system with its roots in the country's history of racism. We also talked about what it will take to achieve more meaningful progress towards equity and justice. Today's guest background will give us plenty to talk about. Stephen Saloom is an attorney and for years has been an advocate on criminal justice reform issues. More recently, Stephen has shifted from specializing in that issue area toward being more of an advocacy generalist and building a consulting practice. That's a path we share in common, which might be interesting to discuss a little later. Stephen, welcome, and thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, David. I'm glad to be with you.
Yeah. Now, one focus for your consulting and actually some writing and thought leadership has been on the role of community foundations, particularly opportunities for them to do policy change advocacy. In that work, you run into a quite common hesitancy towards advocacy, which is where I'd like to start our discussion. Philanthropies are hardly the only ones for whom advocacy can feel too, quote unquote, political if they're unfamiliar with the policymaking arena. How do you address that reluctance and build a comfort level?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's everybody has a stake in helping to shape how we run our governments, right? It's a democracy. That's simply how it is. And at the same time, David, obviously, it's such a complex and complicated world, right? And we all have our own lives, and while we know generally what we care about and what would like to see happen out there in the world, in kind of our communities, right, at the government level, it's not always easy to have individuals to have kind of a good sense of what to do. And so actually, to that point, we really do lean on our partners in our communities to help understand a lot of the issues of importance to our communities. And so what I'm trying to say there is that, yes, in a democracy, we count on everybody to participate. And I think it's fair and appropriate, especially for those who care about how our governments specifically care about how systems work, to do what we can to help our communities just really understand these issues at almost like at a macro level, right? And to some extent, what's best for government to do, and how can that government approach really help us all lead a good life? This is, as far as I see it, at the root of our democracy, people are supposed to decide how government works, right? And the fact is, people are busy, and really to think about how our government systems should work typically takes a little bit more than you can figure out while you're mowing your lawn, right? Hey, I wonder, what the transportation system should look like in Fairfield County. Well, it's nice. It's actually valuable and very important for especially those our partners in the not-for-profit realm to help, that care about certain issues, to help the public just kind of understand what's up, like the big picture on that, and what are smart ways to proceed. Let's say I don't have children in the school system in the town I'm living in, and uh, uh, I think that I see that the town budget spends a healthy amount of money on education. My feeling might be, look, I don't see why we're spending that much money on education. I don't see why it's important. I don't see why it helps me to try to reach people on issues they already care about, but try to generate,
Uh-huh.
cultivate this sense in the community about the value and importance of certain policies, and even how we shape them and administer them. So for philanthropies, community foundations, which is what I've been specializing in for years, but also foundations writ large, which I've also worked with over the years. They all have missions, right? They're nonprofit organizations in one form or another that have a mission. And in many cases, it's issue focused. Could be the arts, could be education, could be criminal justice, racial equity, whatever it might be, transportation systems, health of a community when it comes to community foundations. My feeling, my belief as pertains to foundations is that foundations should be very mindful of the government policies that impact their missions, should focus on their missions and not just their historical practice of grant making when seeking to advance their missions. And so, in addition, foundations tend to be experts in their mission areas, right? They've talked with all the major nonprofits of concern to them. So I just think
Yeah.
that foundations should see themselves as having a responsibility to educate people, especially in the jurisdictions they're intending to reach, about the policies that impact their mission, because foundations tend to actually be expert in those areas and have a lot of information to share. And yet, unfortunately, most of them say, we don't talk about policy because we can't, quote, lobby, or because it's too political. And I believe that is completely unnecessary and really a bit of a dereliction of duty for most foundations, because they can properly, in a non-explosive way, right, in a non-confrontational way, share information, and even have opinions based on facts and research and whatever else they might, about what the public should consider when they're making their own decisions about what policies are best.
So I guess I posed the question thinking that there's almost like some sort of psychological reassurance dynamic, or some kind of get people to look at it in a different way than they have been. But from your description, it sounds more like straight ahead advocacy, making the case, posing the arguments, and persuading.
Well, it's all in how you do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all in the approach. And I think foundations at every level, and especially community foundations, which are 501c3s and have been granted express latitude, right, to be able to even do some, quote, lobbying. But we'll put lobbying completely aside. All foundations should share the information they know. I mean, obviously in some kind of encapsulated form. And it's fine for them to share the perspective that they have developed based on their mission, right, and their focus. And to say, we have this expertise, we come at it from this angle for the community. You can say that in different ways, right? Just like anything else we can say to each other in the world. You can frame it in a way that is sharing information and nested in concern for everybody in the community and help to demonstrate why this really is for the greater good. Or you can come up, and at the opposite end of this extreme, which I don't suggest, you could come in poking someone in the chest and saying, "Hey, you've got to do this because this is the way the world has to work." So I guess the best way to say it, David, is it ain't what you say; it's the way that you say it. It's the results here, or really that has the impacts. And I think for foundations that are worried about seeming per se political about it, it's entirely within their power and their capabilities of expressing their understandings in ways that can reach broadly, without making people feel like they're being told how they should think. And if foundations alone, or if foundations would alone share think about how to share that information relating to policy in broad ways that can help listeners, busy people, somehow glean it here and there in their lives, and when they do, understand it better. I think foundations will serve their mission far better than they do when they pretend that policy issues are off limits.
So I guess that's the key point, is the natural logic of
Yes.
their connecting with the policymaking process because of what they have to offer, because of what they're intending to do. We should maybe pause for a second on this issue of lobbying and the sort of where the legal line is that you're not supposed to cross, because I don't think people do understand it all that well. Lobbying is, there's a body of people who take a vote on an action, on a statute, on any kind of decision where it's going to be a vote of a body, engaging with members of that body on something that is on their agenda to vote about. Basically, that's the main limit, which, as you and I both know, leaves a tremendous amount of room to engage.
And David, it's even more specific than that. As I recall, I mean, in general, the IRS rule says, which is that there's a tax rules behind all this, right? But the IRS rule says that lobbying is a communication with a legislator about a piece of legislation urging a specific action or position. It has to be those four elements. Now, you described it more broadly, but that's the core of it. And so anything that is not that does not touch on all four of those things is not per se lobbying. There are kind of smaller nuances to it all, but that's roughly it. So there's really a universe of talking about policy that is not lobbying, which is what I think we can safely say that anybody should engage in that, because there are no prohibitions on advocating, on talking about policy, etc. So that's where really the main point of concern would be, how do you say it in the way that you feel comfortable saying it, where you're not, of course, going to go getting any where you don't want to become a political lightning rod. But how can we say what we know without,
Right, with the message, the implicit message here being that you especially have tremendous latitude in engaging with the executive branch. I guess the one fuzzy area in what we've just gone back and forth about is, to the extent that there are policy-making boards or bodies on the executive side, I think those prohibitions may be there, even though that's not legislation.
Yes, and let me say, no, you're right. And let me say this. The rules have evolved a bit over time, and there are, of course, always state and local rules. So all of those should be minded. Ethics, you have to register, whatever it might be. But what I'm talking about is kind of like the prohibition as relates to your 501c3 tax status. And for all listeners, I will say neither David nor I are represent ourselves as your lawyers on this. And although I will say a great resource for all of you to go to if you have any questions about anything here, and really in very lay terms, but that will address the legalities, is Boulder Advocacy at the Alliance for Justice. Yep. Google that. Go there. They will tell you everything you need to know about this. And so that's an excellent resource.
You took the words right out of my mouth. And that is their mission in life.
Yeah.
Is to provide guidance. I should probably have someone from Boulder Advocacy on the podcast at some point.
You should. Yeah. Just before we pivot to that, I want to say one more thing about community foundations in particular, as related to policies. And that is that, there are some 800 community foundations across the country. Almost all of them, maybe all of them, I just don't know. But at least I'm sure that almost all of them claim as their mission, helping to ensure a strong and healthy region, right? Whatever area they serve, that's writ large tends to be their missions. And I just want to note that when community foundations stake that claim, which I think is fabulous, really, really valuable, and I'm thankful for it. But when they stake that claim, they are claiming responsibility for the health of that region in ways that almost no other organization typically does, right? They're saying we're here for everybody in the region to help the entire region prosper so that it's a rising tide that lifts all boats. That's generally the mission of most community foundations. When they take that responsibility, they're actually in some ways taking broader responsibility than most individual policymakers across the region they serve. Because if they are saying, we want to help ensure that the entire community is healthy, and most of them I would say almost all of them would admit they don't have enough grant dollars to ensure that themselves. So I think there's a special responsibility for community foundations who do have 501c3 tax status and have full room to heartily advocate, even so much as lobby, that they have a special responsibility to engage and help educate their populace on the value of certain policy approaches and why that is for the greater good. Just simply cannot ignore the policies and the administration of government that is really going to drive the relative health of their community.
I mean, you're describing a responsibility or a duty that borders on actual public service. I mean, obviously they're not official, elected or appointed, but I think I hear you saying that by virtue of taking on the mission or committing themselves to the mission, that if they are serious about it and just a little bit self-reflective, that this makes them quasi public servants.
I think that's right. At least, and maybe the way to say it, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, let's say from the charitable sector, they have claimed a high level of responsibility for, really, I mean, if they've claimed a high level of responsibility for the health of the entire region, which is typically a function of government. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be doing it, but since they're claiming something that is right alongside government, they're really very much partners because they both want the same thing ostensibly, right? They both exist for the purpose of the health and safety of the community. One is at it from the government end. We know that's its own sphere. The charitable end, there's all sorts of charities and even foundations that one could contribute to. What community foundations say is we're going to help strengthen this entire region. So yes, they are like a partner. I see them as high-level partners to government, some of the highest level partners to government from the charitable sector.
Well, let me use that. Let me use that as a segue to in some of your material describing your consulting practice. You talk about inside outside partnerships,
Yeah.
which
Yes.
a good
Yes.
good way to branch out from what we've just been talking about.
Yes.
Um, how do you see these different players inside and outside of government?
Inside of government, control the levers. Period. Right? They decide
Mm.
policy. They decide law. For the most part, right? There's a democratic process, the whole bit, but they are granted power to move the levers of policy and law, right? So the inside players, that's what they have. Now, if you're an inside player, which would mean, let's just say government official, specifically elected officials, but you would just say government officials writ large because they are all touched by the democratic process, typically. Virtually all government actors want public support for the moves that they think should be made. And obviously, I'm talking about politics here to some extent, right? But simply, they have a duty to some extent to do what's best for the community, and they want the community to see that what they're doing is best for the community. And yet, and yet, even when they have the power, like you did when you were in elected office, and when I was an elected police commissioner in my town, you also know that if you want to secure the support of your colleagues, who may or may not be in the same place as you, it's helpful if you can get folks from outside of government to express their desire in the same direction as you, right? And so if you're inside government, and let's say you want better schools, it's smart for you to partner with others who are outside of government who also want better schools, because those who are inside government have access to the levers and can talk with the other officials involved and impact the entire bureaucracy, which is significant, right? And not easy to change. So even though I might be in government and have access to a lever, rarely can, well, let's just say it's helpful if you have support for whatever you're doing from others inside of government. Typically, the best way to help others inside of government come to the same place as you is to work with those outside of government who can shape the public debate, so that your fellow policymakers, the rest of the bureaucracy, can see that the public is calling for the same thing that you are. So when I say inside outside game, I'm just saying if when people outside of government want to see the folks inside of government do something, and vice versa, they would be wise to be in touch with each other and talk about what they're seeing inside and outside, and really, trying to coordinate their activities to steer things in that direction. Now, I say this, now I'm a nonprofit advocate. I'm really for the greater good. That's where I come from. But the fact is, businesses do this all the time. Campaign contributions all the time. It's much clearer there. It's very often a dollars and cents proposition. If I am Google and I want to make sure that the laws work on Google's behalf, Google is outside of government. They will do things to help other government officials support the policies that they want. They might put ads out there. They might give campaign contributions, etc. In the nonprofit sector, we don't think of it that way. We don't feel so transactional. It's kind of like, oh, well, let the facts and moral decision making rule the day. Well, no, in fact, policymakers need support. Here's the bottom line. For a policymaker to do something you want, and let me back out for 1 second. I want to tell you a story that might be helpful here. I learned this lesson when I started as a lobbyist, Connecticut legislature during welfare reform in the mid-90s. We were lobbying against the fingerprinting of welfare recipients, which the governor on the conservative side decided was, the most important thing Connecticut could do, and it was terrible in a million different ways and completely ineffective on top of it all. But he was making a big deal about it. And so we lobbied the bill in committee and failed, but we got a bunch of votes, failed, and went to the House. We did another vote count of the entire House. I went back to one of the Human Services Committee legislators who had voted with us in committee. And I said, Jim, the governor's fingerprinting bill. I said, it's going to do this, it's going to do that, it's going to waste money, it's going to steer people away that deserve this. Veterans are going to be impacted, etc. He said, Steve, stop. He goes, I completely get it. This is a terrible idea. He said, but I can't vote with you, Steve, because on my last constituent survey, fingerprinting, because of all the how much the governor's been whipping this up, fingerprinting welfare recipients was the number one issue my constituents wanted. So unless you will come door knocking with me this fall to explain my vote on this, I won't be around with you or to work with you next year on the policies that you want. And it was an epiphany to me because as a nonprofit advocate for the greater good, I had convinced, or he was convinced on the merit. I don't know that I convinced him. He was convinced on the merits, but he didn't feel like he had the public support enough to vote the way he thought would be best. It's a somewhat extreme example because that one issue was so pinpointed, but many legislators, especially in the criminal justice realm, on a regular basis, they're taking the general temperature of folks back home, right, in their districts. What do they think about this? Maybe we want to eliminate mandatory minimums. There's all the research in the world and a whole bunch of other reasons saying why it's a really, really bad idea. But electorally, I mean, tough on crime is just, the gift that keeps giving. And so I've often found that certainly it's not the facts alone that persuade folks, but it's elected officials' perception of their voting constituents' perception that will have a big impact on how they will pull the lever, right, when it comes time to vote on a bill. And so when I talk about the inside-outside game, when I talk about Jim Abrams, right, who I was talking about in that example as the state representative, Jim was in the inside, but he didn't even have the power to himself pull the lever, much less get his colleagues to pull the lever because the outside game was lost. The more that the inside game is, or I say game, it's not a game. The inside players are in touch with the outside players in the ecosystem of policymaking, right? Getting back to what I was talking about at the start of the show, the more there can be communication across the two of them, ideally, the better the strategizing, and there's greater ability to enable the government to move in that direction.
This conversation, I think, points towards seeing what politics most essentially is. To my view, I think the common perception or almost misperception is politics is what takes place between two political parties. Right? Politics is politicians fighting. But I think most essentially what politics is things are political the minute there are different public views of an issue, right? Once there's any kind of a split opinion, then it's political. Or we could define a politician as someone who has to care what the public thinks of them and the decisions they're making, cares what the public thinks about issues, which you've just been describing.
And not just for themselves, but also for their ability to work on the inside, right, to get others, to get requisite support, right, within government to be able to do it. So yes, I agree with you, but it's not just a one-on-one thing either. They have to care about how they are going to enable their intended reform to advance.
So hold that thought, because I want to talk about the difference between elected and appointed.
Mhm.
So we're talking on
Sure.
April 10th, 2024, and I am an elected official for about 5 or 6 more days.
Ah,
And one of the things that I found really challenging is people show up and claim to be speaking on behalf of majority sentiment.
mhm.
Now, um, maybe a Connecticut um, legislative district is big enough that that legislator had a way of knowing what the majority sentiment was. Okay, so it was certainly kind of majority of vocal sentiment if an issue was that hot or that salient. But I think we're flying blind most of the time,
Yeah.
certainly at even lower levels of government with smaller constituencies, as to where sentiment or majority sentiment really is. Well, my point that I wanted to make about appointed versus elected officials um, is that in relation to politics, right, and this is kind of an ethic, certainly in local government, probably the other levels as well, that appointed officials um, should be insulated from politics, right? Um, sort of literally the pay grade, although we get paid almost nothing on the city council,
Yeah.
but the pay grade um, uh, for an elected official is to carry the weight of that responsibility for the decision,
Mm.
right? Um, Things get kicked to political decision makers to take responsibility again in our democracy, which is where you started the conversation. So I kind of wanted to bring that point in because I do think that um, career people stand, they need to be aware of politics, but I think they do stand in a different relation to it.
Mhm. Yeah. No, I think that's right. And just to get to your point about understanding majority sentiment, it's impossible, right? Even I think it's impossible to know with certainty what that is, and that's why really my MO in this work, or whatever my guiding principle I've developed, is what I had said, that it's elected officials' perception of their voting constituents' perception, because they go a lot on perception, right? If you get 10 letters on an issue, you're like, wow, people are really lit up in my district, but that's only 10 people, right?
Right.
If you see a big article in the local paper that does a great job, you say, wow, a lot of people read that. So kind of everybody kind of knows. So it's very perception based. But now to get to your point, appointed versus elected, um, I think there are a couple things going on. One, if you're a local official who's been elected, you're not getting paid a lot of money. I wasn't paid anything for my role either. You're doing it because you care, clearly, because it's a lot more work than people realize. Not just the campaigning, but actually keeping up with the issues, going to the meetings. Really voting up. It's a lot of work, and so you got to do it because you want to. Um, uh,
My test question, actually, for anyone considering running for local office, because I think this is even more true for local government than other levels. Um, if you hate meetings, don't do it, because
yeah, not right. I mean,
that's like if you have to go to a lot of meetings. Some
yeah,
they can
because
get long.
just like everything's political, kind of everything in government requires meetings, right? Because it's rarely
Right,
one person who has absolute authority to do whatever they want, right? So you got to meet with other
right.
people. It takes a lot of time. Um, but at the local level, if so, you're not getting paid a lot. You're doing it because you love it. Um, uh, there's two ways to go. The nice thing was, when I was elected to my local board of police commissioners, which is a very unique thing that Connecticut has. Just by the way, listeners, we're, I think, the only state in the country where municipalities create these commissions that have the ultimate authority over all hiring, firing, and promotions within the police department. That's a whole other story. We'll talk about it later. But I was elected to that seat, and I didn't have any designs on higher office or necessarily even more than one 4-year term. And so I was actually pretty free, right, to pursue whatever I wanted, but I still needed to get enough votes on the commission to prevail, right? So I still couldn't do just what I wanted. I still needed to be strategic in going after it. But the other category of local officials are those for whom it's not necessarily a stepping stone, but a step, right? Maybe towards another term or towards another office. And if that's the case, then you need to be even more mindful, because you still need to then try to, corral support from your others, right, for whatever you want to pass. But then you also need to be mindful about the general perception among your future electorates that you're creating. So you need to be careful about that. So as an elected local official, at least, you have those two different approaches. An appointed official, on the one hand, or even just someone who's not necessarily just in the civil service, right? Not just a permanent employee, because they aren't given a ton of discretion, but an appointee who does have decision-making power over elements of policy is freer to act, but almost all of them serve at the pleasure of one or sometimes a small group of elected officials. And so if you think about a police chief in a town where something goes south, right? Something happens that people don't like. That person the chief is typically not elected, but typically that chief was appointed by the mayor or first selectman or whomever, and that mayor or first selectman can yank that person, right? ASAP. So they're not really insulated either. They are insulated, but they're not free of political pressure.
The other thing, I don't know how many other states have open meetings laws quite as strict as Wisconsin does. But one thing that'll be interesting when I leave local government at the end of my term in 6 days is I'll be able to talk to any council members I want, whenever I want, about whatever I want. Whereas now, as a member of the body, open meetings law requires that anything that is on the agenda that is coming up for decision, I can't lobby, I can't nose count to see where people are on an issue, because all of that is supposed to, for good reasons, good democratic reasons, supposed to be talked about out in the open in public meetings.
One other individual member, one at a time?
Well, this gets us to the idea of a walking quorum, because talk to enough one at a time, and there you go. And the public doesn't, where people stand on things. It gets us to the idea of a walking quorum, because talk to enough one at a time, and there you go. And the public doesn't, where people stand on things. And I guess that kind of goes along with the nonpartisan. We don't caucus as party members. We don't appear on the ballot as party members.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
So anyway, so I wanted to kind of loop back to inside outside, and I think this has been great to talk about the most fundamental inside versus outside, which is either inside government or outside of government. And my own definitions, I think of advocates and advocacy as something being done from the outside of government, and what's happening, advocacy within government is championing, and it's different, champions versus advocates. But there's another sense of inside game, outside game, in terms of access, in terms of, frankly, the professionalization of advocacy. And this is where sort of privileged and higher status populations versus marginalized populations come in. right? Because and inside game in this context is about sort of that incrementalism, pragmatism, and working within the constraints of not going too far or pushing too big of a change, because bigger amount of change requires a real significant mobilization and organizing from the outside. So I just kind of wanted to bring those slightly different ideas of inside versus outside into it.
Well, you know, I I think there are folks inside. Well, we see some examples at the federal level, right? Of folks who are inside who want to go far, right? Who don't want to be incrementalists. Plenty of examples of those. So I don't think it's so much of an inside-outside distinction, although I will say that most people who are working from the inside recognize how hard it is to actually go far in one step. And so it, and even for me, as seeking to be an effective advocate throughout my career, I've been beaten back into incrementalism. Even though I'm very impatient for the amount of improvements I think are needed, because to your point, I don't think you need a tremendous. I mean, number one, it's simply hard to institute any change. Period. Full stop. It's extremely hard. Even when you pass a law, implementation is often exceedingly difficult because you have to change how all the gears within government then work. And there's resistance to change in all of those gears that are currently functioning in a certain way. And to adjust them can create problems. Let's just put inefficiencies at the very least. But then to reassemble them in ways that work well is also exceedingly hard. It just is. And I'm not blaming anybody for that. I just think it is. So the more serious you are about changing systems of government, and the more experience you have trying to change systems of government, the more you will realize and recognize the realities of how hard that is. And you will also learn how easy it is to screw things up if you try to do too much at once. And if you are not successful in any of your in whatever your change, those who had fought against you in the first place, because there's always some folks that didn't want it, including perhaps those within government that are would have to implement those changes. They are going to make sure that folks know that your change didn't work. We tried it, it didn't work. Let's go back to the old way. So even on a simple change, it can be very hard to succeed. And if you don't succeed, it's harder for you to get what you're after in the future.
Well, this feels like a perfect segue to something I wanted to make sure that we got to, and it would be good to use our remaining time. As I mentioned in the intro, we both had a similar career trajectory, having branched out later in our careers after many years spent in particular fields or issue areas. And you still are involved in criminal justice reform. I'd love to get your reflections on how that struggle for justice has gone, what the successes and challenges have been in trying to break free of this especially carceral state that we have, with its historical roots in the unfinished Reconstruction post-Civil War.
The country is more aware of the realities now and the injustices than it was, let's say, at the turn of the millennium. Right? Maybe that's a good place to start, because I think that's really where. I think folks are more aware and more sensitive to the realities of the really runaway racial inequity in the criminal justice system.
This society hasn't had the full reckoning.
Oh God, this look. I mean,
yeah,
this
right,
society will probably. I don't want to say never, but certainly not in my lifetime. Fully reckon with and properly address racial inequity in America. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be trying every single day to do so, which we absolutely have to if we care about our country on multiple levels.
So with the modest new awareness, where has that gotten? Where does it still need
Well,
to go? Yeah.
here, with the modest awareness, we did see um, the runaway rise in the criminal justice system has stemmed. That doesn't make things better, but the hemorrhaging, really the hemorrhaging, was stopped. The problem is it had gone a long way down the road, and a lot of systems were built up around that approach. Police
Slowed
department. I
down.
mean, everything, the entire apparatus for well, look, all the legislation that made more things criminal, right? That enhanced the penalties, that encouraged police to arrest more people.
The Rockefeller laws.
Well, I mean, there's so much of it, so far beyond that. Just all of it, David, all of it. Okay. And the public sentiment that was built up, encouraging prosecutors to throw the book at everybody, right? Enabling elected judges or encouraging elected judges to go strong on people, created this entire apparatus of supports around all of that, created jobs, right, for all sorts of different people, even private prisons, corporate shareholders. Everyone was becoming invested in that entire system, so that even when I'll say public recognition of just how terrible, is one word, all of this was, once that turnaround started to happen, number one, it took a long time for policymakers to perceive that enough of their voting constituents were starting to think differently. So they were very slow. It took a long time for them to perceive that there was enough cover for them, especially given how successful all the tough on crime rhetoric was, how deep all the bureaucracy was, and the status quo was, and the power was in support of that previous way of proceeding. It took them a long time to feel emboldened enough to do anything that wasn't even tougher on crime. A sense that their voting constituents thought things had gone too far. Because if I go back to the guy mowing his lawn, this is where I started thinking about when I was in the early 1990s doing criminal justice reform work. I thought, what I might be able to convince somebody that, mandatory minimums are bad. But if you say, well, just decide your next vote for your state representative based on that, he's like, look, you know what? I got a lot of stuff I worry about. That's about 20th on my list. So blah, blah, blah. Anyhow, but it is important. It's not just for policymakers to recognize that. I think all sorts of policymakers, in my experience, recognized it a long time before we stopped the hemorrhaging. But they were like, it's out of my control. I mean, the Democratic Party really, as they tried in the early years to kind of press back on this, but really by the late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, they certainly weren't fighting back as hard to meet it. And I'm not blaming them for that. I'm just saying they analyzed the politics and they thought all was lost. It took them a long time even to feel emboldened to stand up to these outrageous additional things that were coming down the pike. So because the right wing has been so successful, and not just the right wing, but the people that lean into tough on crime. It wasn't even wasn't even so my point is about, you were referencing Black Lives Matter and just the kind of the racial reckoning of whatever extent that happened in the wake of George Floyd's murder. They were really helpful. They did really help to impact a lot of people's thinking, woke up a lot of people. Not always directly, not
Mm.
always, not always in the most politic ways, right? Not always in the ways that could reach everybody, and sometimes, when you speak the truth about racial equity, there are a lot of people that aren't ready to hear it and will
Mm.
reflectively defend against it. Others will opponents of equity will, whenever they can, opportunistically grab some of what has been said and try to scare people away from going down that road. So, but this isn't, there's no individual can assess these movements, right? It's beyond any
Sure.
of us. So I'm not trying to do that. But what I'm saying is, writ large, there were benefits to it, and it helped. It helped at a core level. At the same time, the nuts and bolts of scaling things back is extremely hard, extremely local, and often does really take time because there's so much we have to dismantle mentally, emotionally, bureaucratically, politically, and in every other way. So, and then beyond that, where we are today, I believe it's just really important to think about, when we want these things, how do we talk publicly about them in ways that uh, build the most power possible, right, behind them? Because and it's not always truth that builds the requisite power to make change happen. Sometimes, really, the smartest thing is to take a bit of a behaviorist approach. Think, what's the broader interest in actually doing better? How do we make this something that where everyone can see an element of their own desire, their own benefit playing out if they think of this issue differently? And that's a whole nother subject, right? That's
Well, no, those are really important points, and as I said before, I wanted to get your perspective. Um, by happy coincidence, I think possibly in our next podcast episode or sometime soon, we're going to have a Memphis city councilwoman who uh, successfully pushed for local
mm,
ordinances that that reduce the police's role in traffic spots and
oh yeah, right.
traffic stops and traffic enforcement, which is one sort of lever on this. But this has been a terrific discussion. I'm so grateful that you've come on and talk
No,
about these things with me. I know the audience will get a lot out of it. So thanks so much.
oh, you're welcome, David. Thanks so much for having me.